AI can have environmental impacts, it can have societal impacts, it can have economic impacts. So I think the most pressing currently is governance, especially governance complexity, because the current governance frameworks for AI are really insufficient to manage the risks of increasingly autonomous AI systems, particularly those that we hope will be able to have full agency. And so, for example, we have to factor in actor, agent, and network risks. So ethical challenges will stem from these different levels of governance, including actor governance, which is focused on regulating developers and providers, but also on agent governance, which is about regulating autonomous agents, and ultimately on network governance, where coordination among multiple agents is going to be one of the things we'll have to tackle, a little bit like geopolitics. Then we also have to care for transparency and accountability, where right now, most sophisticated AI either is black box or too complex for most people to explain the decision-making process and therefore understand and possibly justify it. This leads to problems of possible bias and inequality. So the training data can be biased, which results in algorithmic bias in itself. It can lead to inequalities in outcomes, which are already baked in our societal systems. So these are just amplified ultimately, but the data in itself is not the only source of bias. And so identifying all these requires intense training for a lot of the people in the field. We want to also make sure, again, on this point of autonomy, that we have the ability to balance the autonomy of the AI, so its ability to learn, make decisions, with the control that we want to have over them, a little bit like a legal system for us. For example, autonomous vehicles need to have this proper balance to make decisions that we are okay with them making ultimately. Then there's all this idea about privacy violations, because there's a lot of data mining techniques and they're used for training, and sometimes they can be retrieved directly. So there's lots of possible attacks that you can do on different models to retrieve actually sensitive data. And then there's the energy consumption aspect of it all. This requires a lot of energy, and therefore it has a very high environmental impact. And so we have to be conscious of the carbon emissions and the environmental strain of these models on the world. And finally, we also have to consider the human design and the potential for manipulative design, where AI systems can be used to manipulate behavior, like, for example, in advertising. We've seen it in political campaigns, and this ultimately leads to the possibility of coercive use and loss of informed consent. This is a really tricky question, because ethics obviously is a tense subject. The companies have shareholders to answer to, and then they also have the public perception, and then ultimately they also have the perspective of the people themselves working in the company. So there are solutions, like, for example, we talked about governance. You can adopt a multi-layered governance. So you implement actor, agent, and network governance within your systems. Ultimately, you try to handle the autonomous decision-making of the AIs, manage the network governance of the interactions between the agents, and you use this governance framework to make sure that whatever ethical framework you do adopt, it can be implemented within your system. You should prioritize transparency, obviously, and trust. Establish the standards for transparency. You ensure that all your processes are auditable, and this builds trust with your consumers, at large, the stakeholders, and ultimately the regulators. You make sure that processes are understandable and verifiable. This is a work that you can do uphill, and so this leads us back to the idea of ethics by design. So what you want to do is really incorporate the ethical considerations that you want to put in place right from the jump. This implies that you will have an ethics core culture. That means that you will have an ethics department that will have some power and the ability to audit all your projects and make sure that they are involved from the start of your project to the end. Then obviously, there's all the regulatory compliance. So there's more and more AI regulations. They're on the global stage. For example, there's the European AI Act. It focused on risk categorization, and it encouraged adherence to technical standards to mitigate certain risks through certain kinds of certifications like the CE mark. So you could try to follow this regulatory compliance. You could have your legal department pay attention to the ones that are coming up and try to establish what you will have to do in advance such that you're not taken aback. Obviously, this requires training. You have to train your employees and your stakeholders, understanding issues of bias, data privacy, transparency, ethical responsibility. This needs to be done throughout the company at every layer of the company. You can also implement impact assessments. So essentially, you're going to want to have a system to identify and mitigate ethical risks in AI projects to ensure basically the alignment with the internal and external standards. And this can be done either by your ethics team or it can be done automatically. There are tools for this. You want to have diversity in your teams as much as possible, and not just because of DEI standards, but also generally because they will have the ability to see what others may not see. So they'll be able to ensure more equitable outcomes because of the diversity in their perspectives. I have some friends that like to say it's diversity of perspective and thought that matters most, but ultimately diversity of thought is fostered by having a diverse crew. You also want to do continuous monitoring, because it's not because you intended for something to be ethical in the beginning, and it's not because at first it seems like things are going well, that it can't get worse down the line, or that it can have unexpected, unintended consequences. And then finally, in your KPIs, you can have ethical AI metrics. You can have benchmarks for ethical performance. You can have autonomy benchmarks as well. So if you put these into your KPIs, you will be able to keep yourselves accountable. I mean, again, it's another really interesting question and a complicated answer, because as I said, AI can have environmental impacts, it can have societal impacts, it can have economic impacts. So it's not just that we can use AI for good, it also in itself has, by virtue of being an actor in the world, an impact. But if we wanted to stay positive, we can use it for the optimization of resources, for example. We can develop smart cities that optimize resource allocation. We can help with energy consumption, waste management, air quality control. We can try to do adaptive decision making. We can optimize this resource, for example, in the cities to lead to more efficient energy consumption. So there are ways to use it for a good purpose, but you have to consider what kinds of models to use in order for the model itself not to have a print. And so we at Versus favor active inference, especially for urban sustainability, where effectively we use a model that in itself is less energy costly, but also we develop multi-agent systems that can do this resource management and basically focus on minimizing free energy over longer periods of time. So this is the idea of long-term environment viability, where you're not trying to maximize one specific utility function, you're really trying to find this metastable state over long-term periods, and therefore you find strategies that have short-term benefits but also long-term benefits. Your models should also try to prioritize plasticity and adaptation. So they shouldn't just be systems that have elasticity, right? So they shouldn't just allow your system to come back to where it was. It needs to allow whatever you're trying to automate to adapt to new stressors, to new possibilities, especially as our environment is changing. But in general, everything is always moving forward, always changing. So you want to ensure this resilience and flexibility over time as the systems are changing, which is why static models will not be suited for this kind of thing. You also want to understand that sustainability is an emergent property. So you'll have to be able to understand and manage the interdependencies among different actors. And that's why multi-agent systems and ultimately network governance is going to be pretty critical.